Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. And before I even start, I want to apologize to my listeners for being absent Monday and Tuesday. Rather an abrupt change of plans, and I won't go into it except to ask my listeners for prayer. It's heck to get old and deteriorate and suffer some of the pains of aging. And I ask the Lord's blessing that I might continue in His work. Now, we're going to continue where we left off in the book, The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson. And since we missed a couple of days, I want to back up a little bit for continuity purposes. If you're following along in your own copy of the book, please turn to page 486, and I'll begin reading in the last full paragraph on page 486. R.W. Thompson says, and we've been speaking of this document that outlines the beliefs and practices of the papacy post-Vatican Council I, the decree of papal infallibility. And this work is entitled, When Does the Church Speak Infallibly? And it was written by a man by the name of Thomas Francis Knox, and it had the full approval of the Roman Catholic Church, and it was widely read among Roman Catholics all over the world, particularly the United States of America. And it outlines all the power of the papacy, not just Pope Pius IX, who was officially declared infallible, but to remind the listeners that to remind the readers of this work that this decree was only a formality and that the Church has always taught that the popes were infallible, despite the constant quarreling between the popes and the councils over infallibility. And the author makes certain that all of the popes from the very beginning of the Roman Catholic Church, when they made their declarations, their encyclicals and papal bulls, that they spoke without error. They spoke, as it were, with the divine authority of God, and were incapable of sin and error. And that even the decrees of Pope Innocent III, Pope Boniface VIII, and numerous other popes who claimed to be, as it were, God on earth, were also spoken with the aura of infallibility, thus making it official that the Pope is, as it were, God on earth, and should be obeyed without question. Now, one of these popes was Pope Boniface VIII, who issued his encyclical entitled Unum Sanctum, One Holy, and that it was directed specifically at outlining the power and authority over the papacy, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords status. And to sum it up, he literally said that every human being must be subject to the Holy Pontiff. Okay? Taking upon himself the position of Christ in the world. It's, well, blasphemy on steroids, to just put it frankly. Now, R.W. Thompson says, beginning the last full paragraph on page 486, all the Jesuits accept as absolutely true the doctrines announced by the bull Unum Sanctum. Otherwise, they would not be true disciples of Ignatius Loyola. But whether or no others of the faithful consider it binding upon them as an act of infallibility depends, of course, upon the teachings of the Church or of the teachings of the Pope, who, in his single person, represents the Church. About 3 years before the decree of papal infallibility was passed, and in order to mold opinions in its favor, a work emanating from the oratory in London under papal auspices was published, wherein the subject was discussed with thoroughness. That is, the subject of papal infallibility was discussed with thoroughness. Its title was, When Does the Church Speak Infallibly? And the answer was given with satisfactory clearness. In 1870, the year the decree of papal infallibility was passed at the First Vatican Council, a second edition of this work was published for general instruction. That is, it was supposed to be installed into the schools. This was supposed to be taught to children. And it says the author is very explicit. Now, the author's name again was Thomas Francis Knox. He says the author is very explicit and has undoubtedly expressed the belief maintained by the papacy with entire correctness. For if he had not done so, his work would not have been printed and circulated under church approval. He does not hesitate to maintain his propositions by pontifical proofs as far back as Pope Leo I, more than 800 years before Pope Boniface VIII, from which, of course, it may be fairly inferred that no matter when a pope may have lived, his ex cathedra definitions of faith are to be considered infallibly true, independent entirely of the late decree of the Vatican Council. So this is clearly stating that never mind the official declaration of papal infallibility at the Vatican Council of 1870, that which is called the First Vatican Council. Every pope prior to that formal declaration was included in that doctrine of papal infallibility. So all the way back to the beginning of the popes. Now remember, earlier on in this book, R.W. Thompson laid out that the first several hundred years of Roman Catholic Church history had to be fabricated because they could not, they had no formal record of the previous statements of the popes. It's called the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals, and they are generally, almost universally recognized as forgeries. And what these forgeries focused on was establishing the temporal power of the Pope, his kingly status, his status as King of Kings in the world. They were all forgeries. And what we're talking about here, this decree of papal infallibility, which extends all the way back to the very first popes, is simply built on a fabrication and forgeries. So its very foundations are fraudulent, and admittedly so. Roman Catholic historians and scholars have admitted that the donation of, or rather the Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals, are forgeries, simply creations of the papacy to fill in the historical gap of the popes. And the main reason for filling in that history by forgeries was to prove apostolic succession, that every pope was a direct successor of the Apostle Peter. So the very foundation of the papacy depends upon these Pseudo-Isidorian Decretals, these false decretals, as being believed and genuine and authentic, despite the fact that they've been proven over and over to be forgeries. Now, he says, he lays down the general proposition, this author of this work entitled, When Does the Church Speak Infallibly? He lays down the general proposition that infallibility, quote, extends over all truths which have a bearing upon the faith, that is the Roman Catholic faith, in which they call Christianity, and upon the entire welfare of mankind, unquote, and enforces it by showing that Pope Pius IX declared that that infallible teaching was not confined merely to the quote unquote points of doctrine, but embraced also whatsoever, quote, concerns the Church's general good and her rights and discipline, unquote. Besides these, he enumerates as within the papal jurisdiction the, quote, general principles of morality, dogmatic and moral facts, the precise sense of a book or passage of a book, and you might imagine they were talking specifically about the Bible, not to mention all other books, and its conformity to truth, It also speaks about the discipline and worship of the church, the condemnation of secret societies and other societies. It speaks of education, particular moral facts, political truths and principles, theological conclusions, and philosophy and natural sciences. So you can see that this work covers just about every endeavor, every human endeavor, clearly making the Pope the end authority in every subject known to man. Okay, God on earth. They meticulously lay out the jurisdiction of the papacy. And then after meticulously laying out this universal jurisdiction of the Pope, simply say that every man, woman, and child must submit to the Pope, making it thusly clear even to an invalid. It's hard to be misunderstood, even by those who are lacking in mental capacity. In other words, they put it in terms that even an idiot can understand, okay? Not to be offensive. Now, within this broad and almost unlimited range of subjects, pretty much everything is included which concerns either individuals or society, even matters which pertain to nations and states as such. As regards the special subject of education, every system of education is embraced because it involves dogmatic and moral facts, which gives the church the right to judge them. So the church has the right to judge every education system on the planet. That's the assertion made by the papacy. It's embodied in Roman Catholic canon law. So if you have a complaint about the education system in this country or any other country, that question ultimately resides with the papacy. That's where you take up your differences with education, because the papacy controls all education. Now, he continues, he says, quote, and the faithful are bound to submit without appeal to her judgment upon these systems. Okay? So whatever the final word is of the papacy, there is no appeal. On matters of education, the Pope is the final authority. Now it says, as to political truths and principles, the doctrine is equally plain, that so long as the nation or state is in harmony with the Roman Catholic Church, acting in obedience to its commands, the latter will not interfere with it. The church won't interfere with the state. But when it is not compatible with the church and contravenes the divine law as the church interprets it, quote, that moment it is the church's right and duty, the Roman Catholic Church's right and duty, or the Pope's right and duty as guardian of revealed truth, to interfere and to proclaim to the state the truths which it has ignored and to condemn the erroneous maxims which it has adopted, unquote. That is, to condemn it as heretical and illegitimate. Now, what do they teach in the schools? Let's stop and think about it for a while. Let's not go into any great detail, but just enough to give us all a clear picture. They teach globalism, don't they? They teach a one-world government. They teach that all of humanity must find resolutions to common problems that exist all over the world because God made a grievous error. In God's ineptitude, when He said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth, He just forgot to supply all that we need to survive if we were to obey Him and be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. We're running out of oil. We're running out of water. We're just polluting everywhere. We're global warming. There's too much CO2 emissions, and God made a terrible mistake. And so we have to have the Pope to help solve all of our problems. And he says, well, I've got a good idea. Let's make it a matter of dogma in the schools that in order to stave off this eventual self-annihilation through overconsumption Let's teach globalism, and let's teach the universal redistribution of the world's wealth or resources. I mean, it's a matter of survival for mankind. God made an error, and so the Pope has to fix it. And with the help of all the schools, with the help of all the governments of the world, with the help of all the talking heads on television, they've convinced us all that God was a fool, and that now we have to save ourselves. And the Pope's going to help us. Okay? The churches also teach that every religion is respectable. Okay? Ecumenism is taught in the schools. Where my Bible says, God's holy word says, there's no other name under heaven given among men whereby ye must be saved. And that we must be respectful of every man's religion. We must not be offensive of anyone's religion. In other words, the gospel isn't worth the paper it's printed on, and that we must accept error as truth, or at least not point out any errors in someone else's religion, and especially not the Roman Catholic Church, because she's all-powerful. She's the one holy Roman Catholic and Apostolic Church outside of which there is no salvation. And the Pope has decided that he's going to unite all the religions of the world under his pontifical authority. That his papal jurisdiction, his teaching authority, his judging authority, his King of Kings status and Lord of Lords status is going to be extended now all over the world, irregardless of the various religions. And we're going to have a global religion. We're going to have a global government, a global economic system, a global social system, a global, well, everything is going to be vested in the Pope. According to Unum Sanctum, that every man, woman, and child on the planet must be subject to the Roman Pontiff. And this is all being brought about in the world by the Jesuits' influence over the governments, the Roman Catholic Church influence over the governments of the world. They've rejected Jesus Christ. The papacy has always rejected Jesus Christ and his authority, insisting that the Pope is the replacement of Jesus Christ on the earth. And if that is the case, then the Bible has been overthrown by the papacy. The schools have been overthrown. The governments have been overthrown. And even the churches have been overthrown. And at no time more than since Vatican Council II, that concluded in 1965. The Protestants, in a sense, at Vatican Council II, swore that the Protestant Reformation was an error, that the papacy is not the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist, that Antichrist is a single individual that comes just before Christ's return, and therefore the papacy is exonerated as being the historical Antichrist of the Bible. And so now the Protestants of this country and every other country of the world must repent of Protestantism and must reunite with the Roman Catholic Church ecumenically to help form this one world government, to put an end to strife, religious strife in this world, and to put an end to war, and to get on about making a global peace with the Pope being the arbiter of that peace. No mention of Christ at all. You see what hell, futurism, and ecumenism have brought upon the world? R.W. Thompson continues, he says, and in order to make it clear that this power over the state is unlimited, he refers to the Syllabus of Error of 1864 by Pope Pius IX to prove that the Roman Catholic Church has, quote, the right to distinguish error from truth in the domain of political science. Now, this is clearly a call for a union of church and state. Okay? In the Roman Catholic system, the church is all-powerful. The church rules over all the governments of the world, and all the governments of the world serve the church by ruling over the people according to papal dictation. Okay, in essence, forcibly making the whole world Roman Catholic and subject to the Roman Pontiff, as is described in the bull Unum Sanctum. And he says, and before concluding, he deems it necessary to caution the faithful against any appeal to their own intelligence upon, quote, so abstruse, unquote, a subject as infallibility, by admonishing them that, quote, none but a professed theologian, and that means a Roman Catholic priest, has a right to an opinion upon it, that is, papal infallibility. So your minds are inadequate to comprehend papal infallibility. You just must do whatever the priests and the popes tell you to do. Okay? He says that is, that absolute and uninquiring obedience to authority, that is, papal authority, even if it reduces mankind to the condition of stocks and stones, that is the highest Christian duty. In other words, we're all to become like Jesuits, cadavers, with no thought or will of our own. We must simply obey and do as the Pope or the Church, which is the same thing, tells us to believe, think, and do. And he says, unquestionably, the decree of papal infallibility runs back to the earliest ages of the Roman Catholic Church, going behind and including the whole period of the Middle Ages, which Pope Leo XIII calls the blessed ages of faith and obedience. Therefore, the bull Unum Sanctum was within the infallible jurisdiction of Pope Boniface VIII and must be recognized as expressing the true papal faith. That is, what the Vatican Council intended should be so considered. If papal infallibility means anything, it means that he was as incapable of sin or error in the administration of his office as Pope Pius IX and Pope Leo XIII, and consequently, that his doctrines were absolutely true when announced and remain so even today. Semper Eadem, always the same, is the papal motto. You know, in counterfeit of what God says, I change not. I'm the same today and forever. Okay, the Pope is a counterfeit Christ. It says it must mean also that his doctrines are as much a part of the faith as maintained by the papacy as was the decree of the Immaculate Conception of Pope Pius IX or any other act or decree concerning the faith of any of the popes. So the decree of papal infallibility applies equally to every pope, just like it did to Pope Pius IX, who declared, even before Vatican Council I, of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, that Jesus got his divinity not from God, but from Mary. That is what the papacy calls infallibly true and must be believed by every man, woman, and child on the planet. We'll be back right after these messages.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. If you would like Inquisition Update to continue, please support Inquisition Update by supporting First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. Now, R.W. Thompson's making it clear that this decree of papal infallibility was always believed by the popes, that Vatican Council I of 1870, formally making it a dogma of the Church that the Pope was infallible, was just a formality, and that all of the popes shared infallibility, that they were, as it were, God on earth. Now, God says of Himself, I changeth not. I am the same yesterday, today, and forever. The popes also say of themselves, Semper eadem, always the same. That's the papal motto. Literally parroting the words of God with just other words, Latin words, by the way. And he says this must mean also that his doctrines, the Pope's doctrines, are as much a part of the faith that they call Christianity, as maintained by the papacy, as was the decree of Immaculate Conception by Pope Pius IX, or any other act or decree concerning the faith of any of the popes. So, unum sanctum was spoken with the same infallibility as Pope Pius IX's declaration of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, which simply means that Mary was the one who was born immaculately, without original sin, and that Jesus literally got His divinity from His mother, Mary. And that's why they call Mary the Mother of God. Okay, that's what is officially taught in the Roman Catholic Church, that Mary is to be worshipped. As a matter of fact, even as I'm reminded of a discussion that I had last night with a new friend over the telephone, that they venerate images of Jesus placing His crown upon Mary. That the Roman Catholic Church has images of Jesus placing His crown upon Mary. And this was made a dogma of the Church. You must believe this according to the doctrine of papal infallibility. And this was decreed infallibly ex cathedra by Pope Pius IX, even before Vatican Council I. It is to be believed by every quote-unquote Christian, whether you are Catholic or Protestant. And we'll get into this later. You see, we as Protestants think that we are exempt from these papal dogmas, but Rome sees it otherwise. Rome sees us all as subjects to the Pope. Remember unum sanctum? It is necessary for salvation that every human being be subject to the Roman pontiff, not Jesus Christ, the Roman pontiff. Now he says, it can make no difference that the decree of the Immaculate Conception was approved by the Vatican Council, because it took effect before that council met, by virtue of the recognized power and authority of the Pope. No further insistence that the popes always enjoyed infallibility, even before the council, all the way back to the first pope, whose entire history was simply manufactured by the Roman Catholic Church. And it says, and besides, its approval was not necessary to its validity if Pope Pius IX was infallible, because any ex cathedra act of the Pope is considered so binding that even the dissent of a council will avail nothing against it. So this is clearly stating the Pope is the Roman Catholic Church. The councils have no authority when there is a difference between the two. The Pope is the Church. Now, hence, the faithful everywhere are held obligated to accept as part of the faith whatsoever any pope has declared, or shall hereafter declare, within his infallible jurisdiction, relating to the church, the papacy, states, or governments, and especially to the important subject of education. Without this, the doctrine of the Pope's infallibility would have no practical meaning. Now it remains, says R.W. Thompson, consequently, for those whose minds shall be impressed by the foregoing well-attested facts to consider, with all possible seriousness, the relations which the infallible Pope must, from necessity, sustain toward our civil institutions, so long as he shall insist upon the extent of jurisdiction over them, which is now claimed to be conferred by that papal pretension. Okay? What does it mean for us when the Pope claims to be infallible? If this consideration shall be given by a Roman Catholic citizen of the United States, sheltered and protected by our laws, by our Protestant laws, he will surely discover that he is now required to abandon the ancient faith of the Roman Catholic Church that he has venerated throughout his life, and substitute for it a new faith, which heretofore his conscience has rejected, and which require more than 1,000 years of controversy within the Roman Catholic Church and close alliance with the revived Jesuits to accomplish. If it be given by one, quote, native and to the manner born, unquote, whose instinct and education attach him to the form of government which separates the state from the church, as in the United States, and makes the people the primary source of political authority, he will find himself confronted by the proposition of a foreign power to change the character of our institutions so that church and state may be united and the latter made subordinate to the former. That is, the state be made subordinate to the church. And this will devolve upon all such as duly appreciate the benefits of civil and religious liberty, the obligation not to practice intolerance or to deprive any of the just rights of citizenship, but to depend with the necessary firmness and courage all the fundamental principles which were consecrated by the lives and the labors of those who laid the foundation of our government. We cannot afford to have this country ruled over either by Pope Leo XIII, who was the pupil of the Jesuits in early life, or by the Jesuits themselves, who worship Ignatius Loyola as a saint. Now take what this author just said in view of the fact that we now, in the first time in world history, have a Jesuit as a pope. Now he says we have multitudes of Roman Catholics among us, both native and foreign born, whose Christian integrity and conduct commend them to our confidence and fellowship. And many of these are intelligent and instructed enough to see that if Jesuitism were eliminated from the faith, they are eliminated from the faith that they are required to accept, there would be no cause for disturbing strife left between them and their Protestant fellow citizens. But each individual would be left to worship God according to his own conscience, and no human authority would, quote, dare molest or make him afraid, unquote. So R.W. Thompson is making sure that every Roman Catholic realizes the consequences of assenting to papal infallibility, because papal infallibility demands that church and state be united. And Roman Catholics in this country have grown up from the cradle under a government that separates church and state. The Pope is literally calling for an overthrow of the government, and he's asking Roman Catholics, is this what you want? Is this what you want? Do you want the Jesuits to run the government and unite church and state as during the Old World Order? Do you want to reestablish the Old World Order? Do you want to give up all the liberties that the Pope damned in his Syllabus of Error of 1864? Think carefully Roman Catholics, what you are assenting to here when you assent to papal infallibility. And Protestants need to be even more understanding of what bodes for the United States and the governments of the world, every man, woman, and child on the planet, if we are forced to acquiesce to a decree of papal infallibility making the Pope God on earth. R.W. Thompson has written this entire book for the purpose of awakening the eyes and ears of the American citizens, whether they be Roman Catholic or Protestant, to contemplate what is really being proposed here and what its consequences will be. I'll just tell you flatly, it's the New World Order. It's simply the recreation of the old world order on a global scale. We're going back to the Middle Ages. We're going back to the Dark Ages, where there were only two classes of people: the rich ruling elite, the papacy and his priests, and those who managed the land and the resources of the world at the behest of the Pope, and then the people, the abject slaves. That's the way it was in the Middle Ages, and that's the way it's going to be in the New World Order. Now, he says we cannot and must not permit the followers of Ignatius Loyola to enforce here the principles of Gregory VII, Pope Innocent III, Pope Boniface VIII, and other popes who dethroned kings and released their subjects from the obligation of obedience to the governments under which they lived, upon the pretentious claim that by virtue of their infallibility, they were the sole representatives of God upon the earth and had the divine authority, quote, of appointing the temporal power, unquote. They have the divine authority of picking all the kings. Do you Catholics and Protestants love to vote for your government and make a choice? Under papal infallibility, under the New World Order, you don't get to pick anybody. That's a divine institution. That's to be executed by the Pope. He is to pick all the kings of the earth because they're to serve him first and rule over the people with a rod of Roman iron. He says we cannot and we must not consent to be included within the circle of any foreign temporal jurisdiction or within such spiritual jurisdiction as the papal doctrine of infallibility stretches out over the temporal affairs of all the nations. We cannot and must not allow the stars and stripes to be removed from the dome of our nation's capital and the papal flag with its cross and mitre and without a single star to be floated in its place. We cannot and we must not mix ourselves up with the affairs of the European nations, neither to restore the temporal power of the Pope or to change the relations which the Italian people bear to their government. For we cannot do any of these things or suffer them to be done by others without breaking down the barriers and removing the landmarks left by the fathers of our republic, and thereby changing our own bright national inheritance into an inglorious bequest to our children. We must not forget the claim of jurisdiction over the people of the United States, which the Pope now makes by virtue of his assumed infallibility, and which has caused him to send Monsignor Sotoli to this country without diplomatic recognition and without our knowledge or consent to instruct us that our form of government is heretical and may for that reason be removed out of the papal pathway like other heresies, and that our own common schools are nurseries of vice because they do not teach that Protestantism is also heresy, with the curse of God resting upon it. To comprehend the nature and character of this jurisdiction and the claim of pontifical supremacy out of which it grows, it is only necessary to remember that the Council of Trent assumed authority over Protestants as well as Roman Catholics. Now we're getting to it. The Council of Trent was infallible. It was led by the Jesuits, by an infallible pope, and it declared that Protestants are still under the divine authority of the papacy, that they are rebels against the lawful Church of Jesus Christ, and that they are to be brought back into subjection to the Pope one way or the other. And we're seeing it right now today in the United States of America. He says to comprehend the nature and character of this jurisdiction, papal jurisdiction, and the claim of pontifical supremacy out of which it grows, it is only necessary to remember that the Council of Trent assumed authority over Protestants as well as Roman Catholics, and thereby established a precedent which Pope Leo XIII has not been slow to follow. That assemblage held that all baptized persons, no matter of whom the ceremony was solemnized, either in a Protestant church or a Roman Catholic church, if you were baptized in water, you are to be within its ecclesiastical jurisdiction, that is, the Pope's ecclesiastical jurisdiction. And although Protestants are considered as rebels and apostates against the authority of the Roman Catholic Church, they are regarded as amenable to her laws and may rightfully be required to obey them. Peaceably if possible, but if not, then by coercion, when it shall become expedient to attempt it. That's what's going to happen in this country. By force, if necessary. By ecumenical Vatican Council II, if possible, but if not, by force. Okay? Those who bowed the knee to the papacy, those who called themselves Protestants and bent the knee to the papacy during Vatican Council II and subsequent to Vatican Council II, have willingly submitted to the Pope, to the Pope's divine authority. But there's a few holdouts yet, and you can include Inquisition Update in that holdout section, and we're going to be converted to Roman Catholicism by force. We're either going to accept the Jesus cookie and worship the Pope, or we're going to be toast. That's what Rome has in store. He says, Vatican Council II held all baptized persons, no matter by whom the ceremony was solemnized, to be within the Pope's jurisdiction. And although Protestants are considered as rebels and apostates against the authority of the Church, against the authority of the Pope, they are regarded as amenable, that means convertible, to her laws. We're still subject to Roman Catholic canon law, according to the Council of Trent. And we may rightfully be required to obey the popes and the canon laws of the Council of the canon laws of the Roman Catholic Church. We are required to submit peacefully if possible, but if not, then by coercion when it shall become expedient to attempt it. And that day is fast approaching. We're not talking about generations down the road. We're talking about in our lifetimes. Our government is in the process right now of implementing Roman Catholic canon law in this country, and anybody who resists this new authority in this country is going to be regarded as a heretic and treated as heretics were ever since the papacy began. He says these Protestants are likened to sheep who have strayed from the fold, and as belonging to the master, capital M, they have left. That is the Pope. And to soldiers who desert their flag. We're regarded as deserters. Okay, what does the military do to deserters? They're executed, right? And it says, and we are subject to arrest and punishment by our superiors. Now, who are the superiors? The popes, the priests, and the government that serves them. Now it says the Protestant people of the United States are, therefore, in the papal sense, excommunicated heretics. And their government is heretical because it has separated the state from the church. Consequently, the Jesuits maintained by their particular subtle method of reasoning that both the government and the Protestant people of the United States are within the circle of pontifical jurisdiction, and therefore that the Pope has the divine right, as the only infallible representative of God, to deal with this country according to his own discretion. The Pope can do anything he wants with this heretical nation. He says both they who teach this and they who accept it as an essential part of their religious faith lack the true American spirit, whether native or foreign born. That spirit which presided over the councils of the, quote, the fathers, unquote, when they framed our government, and which has given it strength and vigor, as well as beauty, for more than a century of time, according to the writing of this book. Now they are manifestly prepared to see the whole world turn back toward the Middle Ages, when the destinies of all the civilized nations were subject to the arbitrament and will of the popes, when the state was held in subjection by the Roman Catholic Church, when kings were dethroned and their subjects released from their obligation of obedience to them in order to bring all the nations into conformity with the principles and policy of the papacy, and when the masses of mankind were regarded as mere animals, possessing neither the capacity nor the right to govern themselves by laws of their own making. To accomplish these results, they insist that there should be absolute unity of faith, and that everything which stands in the way of this is heresy and must be destroyed. In order to this they claim, as a dogma of the Church, that the popes shall have free and uninterrupted access through their hierarchy, the popes, the priests, the cardinals, and the bishops, to every nation and the people in the world, so that heretical governments may be destroyed and heretical people brought under papal dominion. Now, there's no better way to describe the priesthood of the Roman Catholic Church, the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church, as the shadow government in every nation. That's their business, to overthrow nations. Their admitted business is to overthrow every heretical government. He says, herein they indicate a desire to see revived in the United States the discord, the strifes, and wars which scattered ruin and desolation over the fairest portion of Europe, which constrained France not to permit the bull Unum Sanctum to be published within her borders, Spain to modify it, and the leading nations, especially those acknowledged to be Roman Catholic, to eliminate from all papal bulls such features as threatened encroachments upon their rights and independence. The Protestant people of the United States cannot imitate these latter examples by resorting to harsh and severe measures of defense and protection, says R.W. Thompson. The civil and religious freedom that they have established as the foundation of the institution of their institutions must remain universal. No man's conscience must be restrained, and no man's just rights invaded or diminished. Freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press must maintain the chief cornerstone upon which the national edifice shall rest. But in order to perpetuate these great rights, so essential to each and every citizen of the Republic, our common school system, as now prevailing, must be sheltered and protected from Jesuit assault. And R.W. Thompson concludes his book with a caution. R.W. Thompson, fearful that people would fully understand his book and then react with, or rather overreact, with a like demonstration of religious intolerance as exhibited throughout history by the Roman Catholic Church, warns the American people not to follow that example. He concludes the book by saying, the Protestant people of the United States cannot imitate these latter examples by resorting to harsh and severe measures of defense and protection. The civil and religious freedom they have established as the foundation of their institutions must remain universal. No man's conscience must be restrained, and no man's just rights invaded or diminished. Freedom of thought, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press must remain the chief cornerstone upon which the national edifice shall rest. But in order to perpetuate these great rights, so essential to each and every citizen of the Republic, our common school system, as now prevailing, must be sheltered and protected from Jesuit assault. We should even go further and heed the counsel of Madison, one of our wisest and best presidents. when in one of his messages to Congress, he invited attention, quote, to the advantages of superadding to the means of education provided by the several states a seminary of learning instituted by the national legislature, unquote, whereby the feelings, opinions, and sentiments of youth may be assimilated and thus constitute a wall of security against foreign influences which can never be removed. And whether this shall be accomplished or not, duty to both the present and the future requires of us to remember what the great Pope Clement XIV said in his bull, suppressing the Jesuits by absolute extinction forever, that, quote, care be taken that they, the Jesuits, have no part in the government or direction of the same, unquote. That is, the schools, because, quote, the faculty of teaching youth shall neither be granted nor preserved, but to those who seem inclined to maintain peace in the schools and tranquility in the world, unquote. Now, this obviously excludes the Jesuits from having any authority whatsoever in the teaching of youth in this country. We have to completely revamp our education system in this country. We have to get out all Jesuit influence from the education system of our country. R.W. Thompson continues, he says, he, speaking of Pope Clement XIV, who suppressed the Jesuits, he knew the Jesuits far better than it is possible for us in this country ever to know them, and whether his act of suppressing them was or was not one of infallibility, it constitutes a lesson of history which ought not to be forgotten. And while in our treatment of them we can do nothing at war with the liberal and tolerant spirit of our institutions, or unbecoming to ourselves, we should remember that, quote, thrice is he armed that hath his quarrel just, and he but naked, though locked up in steel, whose conscience with injustice is corrupted, unquote. And I will just conclude by making a personal note. The Pope has no clothes. He is Antichrist. That is the conclusion of R.W. Thompson's book, The Footprints of the Jesuits. This book, together with R.W. Thompson's other book, The Papacy and the Civil Power, which were written along about the same time, the 1870s and 1880s, constitute really the centerpiece of what I've presented here on Inquisition Update since it began. And I encourage my listeners to search the used bookstores, particularly eBay, and get yourself each a copy of these books, The Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson and The Papacy and the Civil Power. And you'll find that Inquisition Update, from now until God takes my breath, will be presenting information in this book that will bring even more light and understanding to what R.W. Thompson has taught us in his books.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. you will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.